Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to fall asleep, and I am here to deliver. But before starting, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I was living in an old apartment building in downtown Chicago, the kind of place that had been around for decades, with a history longer than anyone cared to remember. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. A 12-story brick structure with an outdated lobby, dim lighting, and an old elevator that always made strange noises but never seemed to break down. At least, not in a way that made sense. I moved in after getting a new job at a marketing firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. My schedule was demanding, late nights, early mornings, and too much caffeine in between. Most nights, I'd come home exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open as I rode the elevator up to my unit on the 10th floor. It became routine. Step in, press the button, listen to the hum of the motor, and wait for the doors to open. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth remembering. That all changed one night. I remember it clearly because it was one of those brutally long days at work. The kind where the office air feels thick, the fluorescent lights sting your eyes, and every keystroke sounds like a hammer against your skull. I left the building close to midnight, my shoulders heavy with exhaustion. The streets were nearly empty, the cold wind cutting through my jacket as I walked the few blocks home. By the time I reached my building, I could barely think straight. The lobby was empty as usual. The front desk clerk was nowhere to be seen. He never was at that hour. A faint buzzing sound filled the air, probably from the old fluorescent lights overhead. I pressed the call button for the elevator and leaned against the wall, staring at the floor as I waited. A soft chime broke the silence, and the elevator doors slid open. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the 10th floor, and let my head rest against the cool metal of the elevator wall. The ride up was slow, the usual groans and creaks filling the silence. But nothing seemed out of place. When the doors opened, I walked out without a second thought. My apartment was at the end of the hall. The dim lighting cast long shadows against the worn carpet, but it was nothing I hadn't seen before. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. I barely had the energy to take off my shoes before collapsing onto the couch. The room was silent except for the faint hum of my refrigerator. I was too tired to shower, too drained to even check my phone. I just let my eyes close, the weight of exhaustion pulling me under. At some point, I must have drifted off. But then, something woke me. It wasn't a noise. Not really. More like a feeling. The kind that crawls under your skin and lingers in your chest. A heavy stillness, as if the air itself had thickened. I opened my eyes, blinking against the darkness. The apartment was silent. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling remained. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 3:12 a.m. The kind of time that always felt unsettling. Too late for night, too early for morning. I shook off the unease and got up, heading to the kitchen for a glass of water. The floor felt colder than usual beneath my feet. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I turned back toward the living room, I caught something in my peripheral vision. Something small, something that didn't belong. A shadow. It moved, right in front of the elevator doors. But I was on the 10th floor, and there was no one there. The shadow had been quick, just a flicker in the dimly lit hallway outside my apartment. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was still half asleep, my brain misinterpreting the way the light fell across the floor. But the more I stood there, staring at the elevator doors, the more uneasy I felt. The hallway was silent, too silent. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe the sound of footsteps, the soft whir of the elevator moving, anything to explain what I had just seen. but there was nothing. Just that heavy, unnatural stillness. I took a slow step forward, my bare feet making no sound against the cold floor. The door to my apartment was still locked. I knew that much. But something in my gut told me I needed to check. Not because I wanted to, but because ignoring it wouldn't make the feeling go away. I reached for the peephole, pressing my eye against the cold metal. The hallway stretched out in front of me, just as empty as before. The dim overhead light flickered slightly, casting long, thin shadows across the carpet. At the far end of the corridor, the elevator doors remained closed. Nothing moved. And yet, I could feel something. It wasn't a sound or a shape, just a presence. A cold, sinking weight in my chest that told me I wasn't alone. I stayed like that for what felt like minutes, my breath slow and shallow. The longer I looked, the more the silence pressed in on me. I wanted to pull away, to turn around and pretend I hadn't seen anything at all. But just as I started to step back, something changed. The elevator light flickered. My breath caught in my throat. The doors hadn't opened. There was no ding, no sign of movement. But the small light above the elevator, the one that signaled which floor it was on, had flickered off, then back on again. Like something had passed in front of it. I clenched my jaw. My brain tried to come up with an explanation. Maybe the building's wiring was faulty. Maybe the sensor was malfunctioning. But deep down, I knew better. I pulled away from the peephole and locked the deadbolt, my fingers moving faster than I expected. The metal felt ice cold under my touch, sending a shiver up my spine. I took a deep breath and ran a hand over my face. This was ridiculous. I was exhausted. I had been up for nearly 20 hours, pushing through one of the longest workdays it had in months. I was sleep-deprived, on edge, and probably imagining things. That was the only logical answer. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked back to the couch, trying to ignore the prickling sensation creeping up my neck. The apartment suddenly felt too big, too empty. I turned on the TV, letting the soft glow of the screen fill the dark room. The volume was low, just enough to break the silence. I sat there for a while, watching the screen without really paying attention. Every now and then, I glanced toward the front door. The feeling hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. By the time the clock hit 4 a.m., I had convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Nothing had happened. The elevator light had flickered, that was all. I had seen a shadow, sure, but that could have been anything. The hallway light. A trick of the eyes. I stood up, stretched, and decided to head to bed. Tomorrow was another long day, and the last thing I needed was to show up to work looking like I hadn't slept at all. I turned off the TV, walked down the short hallway to my bedroom, and shut the door behind me. The bed was cold, the sheets stiff from hours without warmth. As I pulled the blanket over me, I let out a slow breath. The feeling of unease still lingered, but I told myself it was just in my head. I closed my eyes. Then, a noise! I sat up instantly, heart hammering. It had been soft, almost imperceptible, but I knew I hadn't imagined it, a faint sound coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. Not footsteps, not the hum of the refrigerator. Something else. A slow, deliberate tap against the wall. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My pulse pounded in my ears. Another tap. And another, like the sound of someone running a single finger along the wall. My body tensed. I forced myself to breathe, to think logically. The apartment next to mine was empty. I knew that because I had seen the moving truck weeks ago. The unit across the hall belonged to an older man who rarely left his home, and he sure as hell wouldn't be up at this hour. So, who was in the hallway? I reached for my phone, my hand shaking. The screen's glow was harsh against the darkness, and I squinted as I checked the time. 4:27 a.m. The tapping continued. Closer now. Right outside my bedroom door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My muscles locked in place, my fingers gripping the phone so tight they ached. The sound was too deliberate, too controlled. It wasn't the pipes. It wasn't the building settling. Someone was out there. And they were waiting. For what? I didn't know. I sat there, listening, every nerve in my body screaming for me to do something, but I didn't know what. I could call someone, but who? The police? And say what? That I heard tapping? That I felt watched? A long silence stretched between each sound, dragging the moments into something unbearable. I willed myself to stay calm. If I panicked, I'd lose control. If I lost control, I wouldn't be able to think. I waited. Then, without warning, a single, heavy knock against the bedroom door. I jumped, my heart slamming against my ribs. This time, it wasn't soft. It wasn't a tap. It was a knock. Slow, purposeful. And then, silence. My breath came in shallow gasps. My fingers hovered over the lock screen of my phone. I could call someone now. I should call someone now. But I didn't. Because the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with something else. Something I couldn't see. Something that was still standing right outside my door. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to convince myself that if I didn't acknowledge it, it would go away. But the moment I opened them, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The shadow. Not on the floor. Not against the door. On the ceiling. Right above my bed. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the ceiling. The shadow was there, stretched across the white surface like a stain. It didn't flicker, didn't shift, didn't move in the way light should. It was just there, dark and wrong. I squeezed my fingers against the blanket, every muscle in my body coiled tight. My mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. Was it a trick of the light? A warped reflection from the street lamps outside? But that didn't make sense. The curtains were shut. The room was dark. There shouldn't have been a shadow. And yet, I could see it. The shape was long and distorted, almost human, but stretched unnaturally, its limbs reaching outward as if trying to grab onto something. The more I stared, the colder the air became, and I felt that same pressure in my chest, the heavy, suffocating presence I had felt in the hallway. I blinked once, and the shadow moved. A sharp, jerking twitch, barely noticeable, but enough to send ice through my veins. I swallowed hard, my body rigid. I didn't dare blink again. My mind screamed at me to run, to move, to do anything but lie there frozen in fear. But my body wouldn't listen. Then, a soft, deliberate scratch against the ceiling. I nearly choked on my breath. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like nails dragging against the drywall, slow and careful. It came from directly above me. I wanted to scream, but my throat had closed up. My fingers dug into the blanket, my body tense and locked in place. Another scratch. Then another. The shadow shifted. I don't know how I managed to move, but somehow I threw myself off the bed. My feet hit the floor, my chest heaving as I staggered backward toward the door. My pulse was pounding so hard it hurt. I reached for the light switch with a shaking hand, flicking it on. Bright, artificial light flooded the room. The ceiling was empty. No shadow, no scratches, just smooth, blank drywall. I stood there, my breath ragged, my body trembling. I didn't trust what I was seeing. My mind was still stuck in that moment, still expecting to see it, to see something, lingering just out of reach. But the room was exactly as it had been before. Except it wasn't. I knew that because of the smell. The air was different now. A damp, moldy scent clung to the space, thick and suffocating. It reminded me of an old basement, the kind left untouched for years. I covered my nose, my stomach twisting. Something had changed. I stepped forward slowly, my body still shaking, and scanned the ceiling. Nothing. I checked the walls, the floor, everything looked normal. But the feeling was still there. I turned to the door and stopped. The bedroom door was open. I knew for a fact I had shut it. I had heard it click into place before I went to bed. And yet, now, it stood open just a few inches, wide enough for someone to be watching from the other side. I clenched my jaw. My heart hammered against my ribs as I took slow, careful steps forward. The hallway outside was pitch black. The light from my room barely stretched past the doorway, leaving most of it swallowed in darkness. I reached out and placed my hand against the door, pushing it open all the way. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the air was wrong. It felt thick, suffocating, heavy with something unseen. My skin prickled, my instincts screaming at me to shut the door, to go back inside, to pretend nothing was happening. But I had already reached the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't in my head. Something was happening, and I needed to understand what. I spent the next morning trying to convince myself I had imagined everything. Sleep deprivation could do that, right? The mind played tricks when it was exhausted. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize, I couldn't shake the memory of that shadow, of the scratching above my bed, of the way the air had felt thick with something I couldn't explain. I needed answers. I started with the hallway. It looked normal in the daylight, harmless, even. But as I stepped out of my apartment, that same heaviness settled over me. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. I could feel it pressing down on my shoulders, clinging to the walls. I walked toward the elevator, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The light above the doors was steady now, no flickering like last night. I pressed the button, listening as the mechanisms groaned into action. Then I noticed it. The mirror inside the elevator. It stretched across the back wall, reflecting the entire hallway. And when I looked into it, I saw something move behind me. I spun around instantly. Nothing. The hallway was empty. My stomach clenched. I turned back to the mirror, my pulse hammering. The reflection showed exactly what it should have, me, standing there, alone. And yet, I knew I had seen movement. A shadow. A shape. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. The elevator door slid open with a chime, breaking me out of my daze. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The second the doors closed, the light above flickered again. This time, it didn't turn back on. The elevator plunged into darkness. My breath caught in my throat. I fumbled for my phone, the screen casting a faint glow around the small space. The air felt colder now, pressing in from all sides. Then, from somewhere in the dark, a whisper. I didn't catch the words. They were soft, distorted, just barely audible. My entire body tensed, my breath shallow. I raised my phone, the light sweeping across the empty space. Nothing. And yet, the feeling of something standing right behind me was overwhelming. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the light flickered back on. I exhaled sharply, my chest heaving. The elevator doors slid open on the ground floor, and I stumbled out, my legs unsteady. I turned back to look at the mirror inside. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't right. My posture was off, stiff, unnatural. My head was tilted just slightly to the side. And my eyes, they weren't looking at me. They were looking past me, as if something else was standing in the elevator. Something I couldn't see. I couldn't stay in my apartment. Not after that. I spent the rest of the day out, walking aimlessly, trying to clear my mind. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. That night, I hesitated before stepping into the elevator again. The lights were normal, but I couldn't stop myself from staring at the mirror, half expecting to see that twisted reflection again. The ride up was quiet, too quiet. When I reached my floor, the hallway was dark. I knew for a fact that the overhead lights had been working earlier, and yet now they were out. The only source of light came from beneath my apartment door. And then, a shadow moved against the light. The moment I saw the shadow move beneath my apartment door, my body locked up. It was unmistakable, a figure standing inside my apartment, blocking the faint glow from my bedside lamp. My chest tightened, my breath shallow. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My brain scrambled for an explanation, but there was none. I had locked the door before leaving. I had checked it. And yet, something was inside. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. Every survival instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave, to get out. But my feet wouldn't budge. Then, the light inside flickered. For a split second, the shadow grew longer, stretching across the floor like a distorted reflection of something not quite human. The shape flickered unnaturally, as if it didn't belong in this world. And then, the doorknob turned. A slow, deliberate motion. The sound of metal creaking filled the silent hallway, each movement rattling through my bones. My breathing hitched, my pulse hammering. I took a step back, then another. My back pressed against the cold wall. The door creaked open just an inch. Nothing but darkness spilled out. The lamp inside had shut off completely. I stared, unblinking, my body shaking. My fingers clenched into fists at my sides, my nails digging into my palms. Then, from within the darkness, a breath. It wasn't mine. It was low, ragged. A wheezing inhale, drawn out like something was struggling to fill its lungs. I couldn't see anything past the opening, but I felt it. Something standing just beyond the door, watching me, waiting. I forced my body to move. My arm shot out, slamming the door shut with every ounce of strength I had. The impact sent a sharp echo through the hallway, but I didn't care. My hands fumbled for the lock, twisting it with trembling fingers. Click! The bolt slid into place. I stumbled back, panting. My entire body was shaking so hard my knees nearly buckled. I pressed a hand against my chest, trying to steady my breath. Silence! I stood there, waiting, listening. Nothing. Had I imagined it? Had the exhaustion and stress finally pushed me over the edge? Then, through the door, tap! A single knock. Soft. Slow. I choked on my breath. My back hit the opposite wall. Another tap. Then another. A steady, deliberate rhythm, as if whoever or whatever was inside was toying with me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to drown out the sound. My heart pounded against my ribs, my entire body rigid with terror. And then, the knocking stopped. Silence stretched on. I barely had time to process what was happening before I heard something far worse. The lock twisted, slowly, deliberately, the same way I had just locked it. Click. The bolt slid back. The door creaked open. I ran. I didn't look. I didn't breathe. I just turned and sprinted down the hall, my legs moving faster than I thought possible. I heard the door swing open fully behind me, but I didn't stop. I hit the elevator button frantically, slamming my palm against it over and over. Nothing. The elevator wasn't coming. I turned toward the stairwell. The door was just a few feet away, if I could just make it. The lights flickered out. Pitch darkness. Then, footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming from my apartment, coming toward me. My breath came in short gasps. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it. Each step deliberate, each step closer. I spun toward the stairwell, reaching for the door handle, and something grabbed my wrist. It wasn't a normal grip. It was ice cold. My skin burned from the sheer chill of it, a stabbing sensation that shot up my arm. My muscles locked up instantly. The air around me felt suffocating, pressing down on my chest, crushing the breath from my lungs. And then, a whisper, right in my ear. "You let me in." I gasped, wrenching my arm free with all my strength. The second I broke contact, I stumbled forward, my body moving on pure instinct. My fingers found the stairwell door, and I threw it open, nearly tripping over my own feet as I rushed inside. The door slammed shut behind me. I collapsed against the railing, sucking in gulps of air. My wrist ached, the skin freezing to the touch. For several long moments, I sat there, chest heaving, heart hammering. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I did, I would see something standing behind the door. Waiting. Watching. I didn't stop running until I reached the ground floor. I didn't go back to my apartment. I couldn't. Not after what had happened. Not after what I had seen, what I had felt. I spent the night at a cheap motel, locked inside a room with the lights on, my back pressed against the headboard. Sleep was out of the question. My mind replayed the events over and over. The shadow, the whispers, the way the lock had turned on its own. But the worst part, the cold grip on my wrist. Even hours later, my skin still tingled where it had touched me. Whatever was in that apartment, it was real, and it had been waiting for me. All it had needed was for me to let it in. I didn't step foot in my apartment again. I couldn't. Not after what happened that night. I sat in the cheap motel room for hours, staring at the wall, my mind looping over every single detail. The shadow, the breath, the way the lock turned on its own, the thing that had grabbed me. Even now, I could still feel the cold touch lingering on my wrist. It wasn't normal. It wasn't human. I tried to convince myself I was just exhausted, that my mind had twisted reality under stress. But I knew better. I had felt it. I had heard it. By morning, I made up my mind. I wasn't going back. I couldn't. Everything I owned was still in that apartment, but none of it mattered anymore. Clothes, furniture, electronics, none of it was worth facing whatever was in there. I booked another night at the motel and called my landlord, telling him I was moving out immediately. He seemed surprised, but didn't argue. I wasn't the first tenant to leave suddenly. That was the first confirmation that sent a chill through my bones. I pressed him for details. Had anyone else experienced something? Had something happened in that apartment before I moved in? There was a long silence. Then he cleared his throat and muttered something about people being superstitious. He told me if I wanted to break my lease, I had to come in and sign some paperwork. The thought of stepping back into that building made my stomach twist. But I wasn't leaving any loose ends. I agreed. That afternoon, I forced myself to go back. I didn't go alone. A friend, one of the only people I had told about the incident, offered to come with me. He didn't believe in the paranormal, but he could see how shaken I was. The second we stepped into the building, I felt it. The same heaviness in the air. Like something was waiting. We took the elevator up in silence. My hands were clammy, my heart thudding against my ribs. As we neared my apartment door, my steps slowed. It looked normal, exactly how I had left it. But I knew it wasn't empty. My friend gave me a strange look as I hesitated. "You sure you don't want to grab some of your stuff?" he asked. "I mean, you lived here for months. You don't want at least a few things?" I shook my head. "No, I reached into my pocket, pulled out the keys, and set them on the ground outside the door. That was it. I wasn't stepping inside. Something in that apartment had been waiting for me to come home. I wasn't giving it another chance. We turned and walked away. I signed the paperwork, handed over my key fob, and left that building forever. For weeks, I had trouble sleeping. Every night, I replayed that moment in my head, the whisper right in my ear, the cold grip on my wrist. I kept my lights on at night, avoided mirrors in the dark. Sometimes, I caught myself staring at my reflection too long, half expecting to see something else staring back. The feeling of being watched never fully went away. I started researching the building. I needed to know. What I found sent ice through my veins. The apartment had a history. Tenants before me had complained about strange noises, shadows moving at night. Some had broken their leases early. One renter had disappeared. No police reports. No missing persons case. Just gone. The unit sat empty for nearly a year before I moved in. I had been the first new tenant, and something had noticed. I still don't know what it was. A spirit? A presence? Something worse? I never went back to find out. But sometimes, late at night, when I wake up in a cold sweat, I swear I can still hear it. The slow, deliberate tapping. It's been months since I left that apartment, but the memory hasn't faded. If anything, it's only gotten sharper, more vivid in the quiet moments of my life. At first, I told myself that moving away would put an end to it. That once I put enough distance between myself and whatever lived in that place, the feeling would disappear. I was wrong. Some nights, I still wake up suddenly, my heart racing for no reason. I lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear something in the silence. And sometimes, just sometimes, I do. It's never loud, never obvious. Just a faint, almost imperceptible sound. A soft breath, or a quiet, rhythmic tapping. Always just on the edge of my hearing, as if waiting for me to acknowledge it. I never do. I don't look. I don't move. I don't let it in. I used to think hauntings were tied to places. That once you left, the thing, whatever it was, stayed behind. But now I know better. Whatever I encountered in that apartment, it wasn't just in the walls. It wasn't just in the shadows of that hallway. It had been waiting for someone, and I had given it exactly what it wanted. I don't know if it followed me, or if I'm just so shaken by the experience that my mind refuses to let it go. But I know this. Some things don't just stay in the dark. Sometimes, when you open a door, it never fully closes again. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that whisper, "You let me in." Moving into a new place is always a mix of excitement and stress. There's the thrill of having a fresh start, of arranging furniture just the way you want it, of turning an empty space into something that feels like home. But there's also the exhaustion of unpacking, of adjusting to a new environment, of getting used to unfamiliar noises at night. That's exactly what I was going through when I moved into my new apartment last year. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-bedroom unit in an older building on the outskirts of town. The kind of place that had probably seen decades of tenants come and go, each leaving behind traces of their lives in small, imperceptible ways. The floors creaked when I walked, the pipes groaned in the walls. and the elevator had a habit of stopping just an inch below the actual floor level, making every arrival feel like a slight miscalculation. I wasn't looking for luxury though. I needed something affordable, close to work, and quiet enough that I could finally get some decent sleep. The landlord, an older man with a slow, deliberate way of speaking, had warned me that the building had its quirks. He never elaborated on what he meant by that, but I figured he was talking about the occasional plumbing issue or the outdated heating system. Nothing I couldn't handle. I had just gotten out of a long relationship and was looking forward to having a space of my own again. No shared closets, no arguing over what to watch on TV, no passive-aggressive comments about dishes in the sink. Just me, my thoughts, and a place that I could make entirely mine. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time setting things up, arranging furniture, hanging up a few framed prints to make the walls feel less bare. Work kept me busy during the day, and by the time I got home, I was too exhausted to do much other than eat, watch something mindless on my laptop, and crash on the couch. At night, I could hear the usual sounds of apartment life, the muffled voices of neighbors, footsteps in the hallway, the occasional door slamming shut. The building had an odd way of carrying sound, making it hard to tell exactly where noises were coming from. But nothing struck me as unusual. It was just part of living in a place with thin walls and old construction. I had developed a routine pretty quickly. Wake up, go to work, come home, eat dinner, maybe scroll through my phone for a while before bed. Nothing exciting, but that was fine. I had enough chaos in my life before moving here, and the quiet was something I had started to appreciate. But then, little by little, things started to shift. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small things that were easy to brush off. Items not being exactly where I remembered putting them. A light that seemed dimmer than usual, even after changing the bulb. A strange tapping sound that I figured was just the heating system kicking in at odd hours. None of it seemed worth worrying about. After all, it was an old building. Things settled, pipes made noise, and I was probably just more aware of these things because I was still adjusting to living alone. That's what I told myself. But then, one night, something happened that I couldn't explain. And from that moment on, my quiet little apartment didn't feel so comforting anymore. It started with something small. I had been in the apartment for about 3 weeks, and by that point, I was fully settled into my routine. Work was draining as always, and by the time I got home, all I wanted to do was eat, relax, and pass out. I was getting used to the odd sounds of the building, the creaks, the occasional thud from a neighbor, the low hum of the refrigerator that seemed louder at night. Then one evening, something caught my attention. I had just finished eating dinner and was washing my plate when I heard a noise. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, a soft shuffling sound, like fabric brushing against fabric. At first, I thought it was coming from outside my window, maybe someone walking by on the sidewalk below. But when I turned off the faucet and listened closer, it seemed to be coming from inside the apartment. I glanced around. Everything looked normal. The living room was just as I had left it. My bedroom door was open, and nothing seemed out of place. I walked through the apartment, checking every corner like an idiot in a horror movie. The closet, the bathroom, even under the bed. Nothing. I chalked it up to the apartment settling or the neighbors moving around. That's what I had been telling myself about every unexplained sound so far, and there was no reason to stop now. But then, the next night, it happened again. This time, I was in bed, half asleep when I heard it. That same soft shuffling sound, like someone moving just out of sight. My eyes snapped open, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, listening. It was coming from the living room. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, the harsh beam cutting through the darkness. Slowly, I sat up and swung my legs over the side of the bed. My apartment wasn't big, just a bedroom, a bathroom, and a small combined living and kitchen area. If someone was in here, they wouldn't have anywhere to hide for long. I stepped out of the bedroom, moving cautiously, the light from my phone bouncing off the walls. The living room was empty. The couch was just as I had left it, my laptop still sitting on the coffee table, the curtains drawn shut. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The closet door, just a small one near the entrance where I kept my jackets and shoes, was open about an inch. I was sure I had closed it. I hesitated, every instinct telling me not to go near it. My irrational brain was already feeding me explanations. Maybe I hadn't latched it all the way. Maybe air pressure from me walking around had caused it to shift. But that didn't explain the shuffling. I reached out and yanked the door open. Empty. Just my coats hanging there, a couple of boxes stacked on the floor. Nothing that could have made that noise. I stood there for a long moment, heart still hammering in my chest, before finally shutting the door again. I checked the lock on the front door, double-checked the windows, then went back to bed. I told myself I was overreacting, that I had been half asleep and imagined it, that maybe the sound had been from outside. But I didn't sleep well that night. Every little creak of the apartment had me wide awake, staring at the ceiling. A few days passed without incident, and I started to relax again. Then, something even stranger happened. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone. The sun was filtering through the curtains, and for the first time in a while, I felt comfortable in the apartment. Then I heard it. A soft knock, but not at the door. It came from inside the apartment. I froze, my grip tightening on my phone. The knock came again. Slow, deliberate. It was coming from the wall, the one that separated my living room from the bathroom. I stared at the wall, my mind racing. I didn't share that wall with another apartment. The bathroom was small, and there was nothing on the other side except the pipes running through the building. There was no reason why I should be hearing knocking from inside of it. I stood up slowly, taking a cautious step closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I placed my hand on the wall. It felt normal, cool, solid. I stayed like that for a few minutes, listening, waiting. Nothing. I pulled my hand away and exhaled, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe the pipes were shifting. Maybe it was some kind of weird acoustic effect from the old building. That night, though, I dreamed of something standing in the dark, just beyond my vision. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but I felt it, watching. I woke up covered in sweat, my throat dry, my heart racing. And from somewhere in the apartment, and this time, it was closer. At first, I told myself it was my imagination, that I was just getting too caught up in every little noise, letting my mind play tricks on me. But as the days went on, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The strange sounds weren't just occasional now. They were happening every night. That soft shuffling sound, it was no longer distant. It wasn't something I could dismiss as coming from the hallway or another apartment. It was inside my space. The knocking on the bathroom wall? That happened again, too. And this time, it didn't stop after 2 knocks. I was sitting on the couch late one night, scrolling through my phone with the TV on low in the background. I was exhausted from work, barely paying attention to anything, when, knock. I looked up immediately, my body tensing. Then, knock, knock, knock. Slow, deliberate, coming from the exact same spot in the wall. I sat frozen, my phone still in my hand, heart thudding against my ribs. Then something changed. It wasn't just knocking anymore. I heard something dragging inside the wall. A slow, scraping sound, like nails or fingertips running along the inside of the drywall. It moved downward, following some invisible path inside the structure of the apartment. And then, silence. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. I slept with the lights on that night. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what had happened. It had to be something structural, right? The pipes, the old framework shifting, maybe even rodents or something inside the walls. That last thought disturbed me, but it was better than the alternative. I called the landlord. I didn't tell him about the knocking or the dragging, just that I had been hearing weird noises in the walls, that I wanted someone to check for any issues. He sighed in that tired way of his, like he had heard this before, and told me he'd send someone over in a few days. That night, though, something happened that made me wonder if I should even wait that long. I woke up at exactly 3:12 a.m. I didn't know why at first. My eyes snapped open, my heart already racing before I was even fully conscious. The room was silent. My bedside lamp was still on, dim, but enough to keep the shadows from feeling too deep. Then I heard it. My bedroom door. The sound of it slowly creaking open. I turned my head just in time to see it stop, open just a few inches. I stared, frozen in place. I had closed that door. I was sure of it. My mind was screaming at me to get up, to check, to make sure no one was there. But my body refused to move. I kept my breathing as quiet as possible, listening, waiting. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. I reached for my phone, hand shaking, and turned on the flashlight. The bright light filled the room, casting harsh shadows along the walls. Nothing. I swung my legs over the bed, forcing myself to move. With slow, careful steps, I made my way to the door. I braced myself before grabbing the edge and pulling it open the rest of the way. The hallway outside was empty. The living room beyond was dark, untouched. I checked the front door. Still locked. Windows shut. No one was here. But I didn't go back to sleep. Instead, I sat on the couch, staring at my bedroom door, trying to convince myself that it hadn't moved on its own. The next morning, I was running on barely 2 hours of sleep, and my patience was wearing thin. I called out of work and decided to check the apartment myself. I grabbed a flashlight, pulled out my toolkit, and started tapping along the walls, pressing against different spots, looking for anything off. When I got to the bathroom, I hesitated. That damn wall. I placed my palm against it, feeling for vibrations, listening. Nothing. Then, on impulse, I knocked. For a moment, there was silence. Then, knock, knock, knock. My hand jerked back as if I had been burned. I stumbled away from the wall, my breath coming in short gasps. That hadn't been an echo. It hadn't been delayed. Something had knocked back. I grabbed my phone and called the landlord again, this time demanding that someone come check the apartment immediately. He finally agreed to send a maintenance guy the next day. That night, I hardly slept. I kept my bedroom door shut and locked, the bedside lamp on the highest setting. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the feeling of something brushing against my foot. I bolted upright, yanking my legs up onto the bed, heart hammering. The room was silent. I looked down at the floor. The blanket that had been covering me was now halfway across the room. I didn't sleep after that. The maintenance guy showed up around noon. He was a quiet, older man with rough hands and tired eyes, like someone who had been doing this job for too many years. I told him about the noises in the walls, about how it sounded like something moving inside. I left out the rest, the knocking, the dragging, the feeling that something was watching me. He gave me a long look before finally sighing and grabbing his tools. For the next hour, I watched as he inspected the walls, listening, tapping, even cutting a small hole near the base of the bathroom wall to check inside. "There's nothing in here," he finally said, shaking his head. "No rodents, no bad pipes. Walls are just old, probably carrying sound weird." I nodded, pretending to believe him. But as he was packing up his tools, I noticed something. The closet door near the entrance, the one that had been slightly open that first night, was open again. Wide open. I hadn't touched it. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to walk over. The closet was empty except for my coats, my shoes, and a few boxes. But something was wrong. The coats! They were all turned around, facing the back wall. I felt the blood drain from my face. I turned to the maintenance guy, my voice shaking. Did you open this closet?" He looked at me, confused. "No, didn't touch anything but the bathroom wall." I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to say anything else. He left soon after, telling me to call again if the noise comes back. I locked the door behind him, then turned back to the closet. I stood there for a long time, staring at those turned around coats. Something was in this apartment, and it wasn't leaving. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sleep. I wasn't going to ignore it. I needed to know. Whatever was happening in my apartment, whatever was inside the walls, moving my things, opening doors, knocking, I had to face it. So I sat on the couch, phone in hand, recording. The TV was off. The lights were dim, but not dark enough to let the shadows creep in too much. I had set my bedroom door wide open, watching it carefully. The closet door by the entrance was shut. And then I waited. At first, nothing happened. An hour passed. Then 2. I fought against the exhaustion creeping in, forcing myself to stay alert. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the temperature in the apartment dropped. Not just a subtle chill, I mean a sudden, drastic change. My breath came out in a visible cloud, and I felt goosebumps rise along my arms. Then, the knocking started. Knock, knock, knock. But this time, it wasn't coming from the bathroom wall. It was coming from the closet. I gripped my phone, watching, heart pounding in my ears. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, deliberate. The door didn't move, but I could feel something on the other side. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around my phone. I stood up. Step by step, I moved toward the closet. My breath was shallow, my legs felt like lead, but I forced myself forward. As I reached the door, I hesitated. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to open it. But I did. Slowly, I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the handle. And pulled. The door swung open. For a moment, there was nothing. Just my coats, my shoes, my boxes. Then I noticed something. The back wall of the closet. There was a hole. Not just a crack, not just a dent, an actual gaping hole in the drywall about the size of a basketball. And from inside that hole, something moved. I sucked in a sharp breath, stepping back instinctively. The hole was deep, too deep, like there was a hidden space behind the closet that shouldn't exist. And inside it, something shifted. I lifted my phone, hand shaking, and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing eyes. 2 sunken, hollow eyes staring out at me from the darkness. A face, pale, gaunt, pressed against the opening as if trying to push through. My breath caught in my throat. The skin was stretched too tight over sharp cheekbones. The mouth, too wide, lips cracked, corners torn. It didn't move like a person. It twitched, like it wasn't used to moving. Then, it smiled. A slow, awful grin that spread too far across its face, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. A rasping breath came from the hole, followed by a voice. A voice that sounded exactly like mine. "Why did you open the door?" I stumbled back, my phone slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The thing crawled forward, not like a person, not like anything human. Its limbs moved wrong, disjointed, unnatural. Its fingers were too long, tipped with broken nails that scraped against the wooden floor. I couldn't breathe. It reached out, one bony hand stretching toward me, and then I ran. I don't remember making it to the front door. I don't remember fumbling with the locks, throwing myself out into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. But suddenly, I was standing outside my apartment, gasping for breath, my back pressed against the opposite wall. I could still feel it, watching me from the other side of the door. I didn't stay to see what it would do next. I ran down the stairs, barefoot, not stopping until I was outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap. Only then did I finally turn back. My apartment was dark, but in the window, just barely visible in the dim light, a shadow standing inside. I didn't go back inside. Not that night. Not the next night. In fact, I never stepped foot in that apartment again. I stood outside in the cold for what felt like hours, staring up at the dark window, watching, waiting to see if it would move again. It didn't. The shadow remained perfectly still, standing right where I had last seen it. It was almost as if it knew I was watching. I didn't know what to do. Who do you even call when something like this happens? The police? What was I supposed to tell them? That there was some kind of thing living in my walls? That something had crawled out of a hole in my closet and spoken to me in my own voice? They'd either think I was insane or on something. And maybe I was. Maybe I had lost my mind. But even if that were true, I wasn't going back in there. By the time the sun started to rise, I made a decision. I needed to get out. I pulled out my phone, hands still shaking, and booked the first available hotel I could find. Then I got in my car and left. I didn't pack. I didn't go back for my things. I just drove. And as I pulled away from the apartment complex, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Relief. But it didn't last. Because the moment I checked into the hotel, shut the door behind me, and sat down on the bed, I saw something that sent a fresh wave of panic through my entire body. My phone. Still recording. I had dropped it on the floor when I ran. I was sure of it. But somehow it was in my pocket. I hesitated before pressing play. The video was dark at first, only catching the blurry motion of my feet as I backed away from the closet. The audio, though, it was clear. My ragged breathing, the sound of my phone hitting the floor. And then, the voice. "Why did you open the door?" My own voice. But after that, there was something else. Something I hadn't heard before. A whisper. So faint, I almost missed it. I rewound the video, turning the volume all the way up, pressing the phone to my ear. The whisper came right before I ran. "I let you see me. Now I see you." I stopped breathing. The room felt smaller, tighter, like something unseen had pressed in around me. I turned off the phone. For the next few days, I stayed at the hotel. I ignored the calls from my landlord. I ignored the texts from friends asking why I hadn't been home. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I just stayed locked in that room, phone turned off, barely sleeping. But the exhaustion caught up to me eventually. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, my closet door was open. Not the one from the apartment, the one in the hotel room. I knew for a fact I had closed it. And yet, now it was cracked open just enough for darkness to spill out into the room. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and stood up on shaking legs. I walked over, reached out, and shut the door. But before I could step away, I heard it. A single knock from the other side. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I had left the apartment, but it had followed me. I never went back to that apartment. I never packed my things. I never checked the closet again. I never even told my landlord why I left. I just disappeared. I moved to a new city, found a different place to live, one with no history, no hidden spaces, no dark corners that felt wrong. For a while, I thought I had outrun it, that maybe I had imagined the whole thing, that sleep deprivation and stress had twisted my mind into seeing something that wasn't there. But deep down, I knew some things don't stay behind. Some things follow you. For weeks after I left, I tried to go back to normal. I ignored the gnawing feeling in my gut. I kept my closet doors shut, avoided looking into dark spaces for too long, left the lights on at night. But the knocking never stopped, no matter where I went. At first, it was small. A soft tap against my bedroom wall. A distant knock from inside the bathroom. Then it got closer. The closet. The nightstand. The headboard of my bed. Always 3 knocks. Always when I was alone. And then, the voice came back. I was lying in bed one night, barely drifting off, when I heard it. A whisper, right beside my ear. I see you. I don't sleep much anymore. I don't stay in one place for too long. I've learned to keep moving, to never let the shadows settle around me. Because whatever I let out of that wall, whatever saw me that night, it's still watching. And one day, I know, it's going to do more than knock. I was 23 when it happened, fresh out of college, stuck in that weird limbo where childhood felt like a distant dream and adulthood was a road stretching endlessly ahead. I had just moved back to my hometown, a quiet, forgotten place surrounded by dense forests and winding back roads. The kind of town where the biggest news was the occasional store closing or someone's dog getting loose. I wasn't alone. My best friend and I had known each other since we were kids, bonded over old horror movies and late-night urban legend hunts. He had always been the reckless one, the one pushing boundaries, while I was more content to stay within the lines. We had a third friend too, someone who was always down for an adventure. The 3 of us had spent years exploring every abandoned building, every so-called haunted spot within driving distance. But nothing we had ever done compared to what we found that summer. It started like any other weekend. We were bored, restless, and looking for something to do. That's when my friend mentioned the tunnel. I heard about it from my cousin, he said, tossing a rock into the lake as we sat near the shore. There's this old tunnel, way out past the train tracks. Supposedly, it was part of an unfinished subway project back in the 40s, but they shut it down after some workers went missing. I rolled my eyes. Every abandoned place has a story like that. Yeah, but this one's different. People say if you go inside at night, you can hear voices. Our third friend scoffed. Voices, huh? Probably just echoes, or junkies. That's the thing, my friend continued. No one stays inside for long. They always leave. Some say they feel sick. Others say they see shadows moving. I wasn't buying it. We had heard it all before. Ghost stories passed around like cheap currency. But when he pulled up an old forum post with grainy pictures of the tunnel entrance, something about it got under my skin. The entrance was surrounded by trees, almost hidden like nature itself was trying to swallow it whole. The walls were cracked, covered in layers of graffiti, some of it fresh, some of it so old the paint had started peeling away. And then there were the comments. People claiming they had gone inside, only to leave minutes later with an overwhelming sense of dread. Fine, I said, standing up. Let's check it out. That night, We packed up some flashlights, threw on hoodies, and drove out past the train tracks. The road was long and empty, the kind that made you feel like you were the last person on Earth. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional rustling in the trees. By the time we reached the entrance, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting everything in a dull, grayish-blue light. The tunnel was bigger than I had expected, wide enough for a train that never came. The entrance yawned open, a perfect black void against the crumbling concrete. A rusted, no trespassing sign hung at an awkward angle, half buried in dirt. "We going in or what?" my friend asked, pulling out his flashlight. I hesitated for a second before clicking mine on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the walls lined with decades of graffiti. Some of it was normal, names, symbols, vulgar drawings, but further in, the spray paint turned. Different. Shapes that didn't quite make sense, words that didn't look like any language I had ever seen. The deeper we looked, the worse it got. My third friend shivered. "Man, this place feels wrong." We hadn't even stepped inside yet. We stood at the tunnel entrance, flashlights in hand, staring into the void ahead. The air coming from inside was stale, carrying a damp, almost metallic scent. Something about it reminded me of an old basement that had been sealed off for too long, heavy, unmoving, like the air itself was thicker here. "All right," my friend said, breaking the silence. "Let's do this." He stepped forward first, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I followed, feeling the crunch of gravel under my shoes. Our third friend hesitated, but eventually sighed and walked in behind us. The tunnel swallowed the sound of our footsteps, muffling everything like we had just stepped into a different world. The deeper we went, the colder it got. Not just a little chill from the lack of sunlight. This was different. A biting cold that felt unnatural, seeping through our clothes and settling into our bones. "Anyone else freezing?" I asked, rubbing my arms. "Yeah," my friend muttered. "Kinda weird, right?" There was something else, too. A faint noise, so quiet I almost thought I was imagining it, a distant hum, like the sound of an old generator struggling to stay alive. It wasn't steady, it wavered, sometimes fading completely before returning in a low, pulsing rhythm. "You hear that?" I asked. My third friend stopped walking, tilting his head. "Yeah, but what is it?" "No idea." The tunnel stretched on, and we pressed forward, passing old rusted beams and crumbling concrete. The graffiti became more erratic, more desperate looking. At first, it was just names and random symbols, but soon we started seeing strange messages. "Turn back. Don't go further. I'd seize you." I tried to laugh it off. Probably just some bored teenagers messing around, trying to scare anyone who wandered in. But something about the way the letters were smeared across the wall, almost like they had been written in a hurry, unsettled me. A few minutes later, we reached what looked like a collapsed section of the tunnel. Large chunks of concrete and twisted metal pipes jutted out at odd angles, creating jagged shadows that our flashlights struggled to cut through. The path was still clear enough to continue, but we had to be careful where we stepped. That's when we heard it. Whisper. Faint. Almost too quiet to notice. I froze. "Did you hear that?" My friend nodded slowly, his face suddenly serious. "Yeah." My third friend turned in a circle, sweeping his flashlight around. "Who's there?" "Silence!" The whisper was gone, if it had even been real in the first place. But my skin prickled, every nerve on edge. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the wind slipping through cracks in the tunnel. But then I realized something. There was no wind. The air was completely still. We stood there for a moment, listening, waiting for something, anything, to make sense. But nothing happened. "Let's keep going," my friend said, though his voice wasn't as confident as before. We walked deeper, stepping carefully over the debris. The whisper didn't come back, But something about the tunnel felt different now. The atmosphere had changed, like the air had thickened, pressing against us from all sides. Then, a scraping sound. We all whipped around, flashlights darting across the walls. The sound had come from behind us, near the entrance. A long, slow drag of something against the concrete. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, silence. We exchanged glances, each of us trying to figure out if the others had heard the same thing. "We're not alone," my third friend whispered. No one argued. The silence after that scraping sound was unbearable. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, my grip tightening around the flashlight. None of us spoke. We just stood there, frozen, our lights sweeping across the cracked walls, the graffiti, the piles of debris. The shadows stretched and warped as our beams moved, making everything feel even more unnatural. Then, another noise. This time, it wasn't a scrape, it was a tap. 1, 2, 3. Slow and deliberate, like someone knocking on a door. Except there were no doors here. "Okay," my friend whispered, exhaling sharply. That's not normal." The tapping came again, but this time it sounded closer. I turned toward my third friend. His face had lost all color, his eyes locked on something behind me. I didn't want to turn around. Every part of me screamed, "Don't look," but I had to. I swung my flashlight toward the entrance. Nothing. Just the empty tunnel stretching back into darkness. The walls, the debris, the stillness. But the sound had been real. I knew it had. My friend shook his head. "This is bad, man. This place is wrong." For once, I agreed. But we had come too far to just turn back. That's what I told myself anyway. I wasn't sure if I believed it, or if I was just afraid of looking weak in front of my friends. We pushed forward. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The air was growing colder, enough that I could see my breath misting in the dim light. The smell, too, it had changed. That damp, basement-like scent had turned into something sharper, something metallic and bitter. "Smells like rust," I muttered. "Or blood," my third friend said under his breath. No one responded. We reached a split in the tunnel, one path leading deeper into darkness, the other curving sharply to the right. The second path had a partially collapsed wall, a jagged hole exposing what looked like a separate, smaller tunnel running parallel to the main one. "Which way?" my friend asked. "Straight," I said. "That other tunnel looks unstable." He nodded, but my third friend hesitated, staring at the collapsed section. His flashlight flickered slightly as he moved it along the hole. "I think I see something," he whispered. We turned our lights toward the gap. The rubble cast twisted shadows, making it hard to tell where the broken concrete ended and the darkness began. But there, just beyond the pile, something was reflecting the light. Something wet. A smear of dark red along the cracked surface. Blood! That was it. That was my breaking point. "We're leaving," I said, already turning back. Neither of my friends argued. We retraced our steps, walking quickly but carefully, scanning every inch of the tunnel as we went. The air felt heavier now, like something was pressing down on my shoulders. My skin prickled with the overwhelming sensation of being watched. Then, footsteps. Not ours. Behind us. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But I had to. I swung my flashlight back. Something moved. Not just a flicker of shadow, not just a trick of the light. Something was there. A figure, tall, thin, standing just beyond the reach of our flashlights. The second my light hit it, it was gone. Not like it ran. Not like it ducked into the darkness. It just wasn't there anymore. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I just turned and ran. We ran. The only sound was the frantic slaps of our footsteps against the damp concrete, echoing wildly down the tunnel. My flashlight bobbed erratically as I sprinted, my breath ragged, my heartbeat so loud it drowned out everything else. I didn't know if my friends were keeping up. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But then, that sound. Not footsteps. Not tapping. Breathing. Right behind me. Labored. Wet. Too close. I choked on a gasp and forced myself to move faster. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't care. The tunnel had to end somewhere. There had to be a way out. A sharp cry rang out from behind me. My third friend. I skidded to a stop, nearly falling over as I spun around, my flashlight whipping through the darkness. He was on the ground, scrambling backward on his hands, his flashlight rolling away. "Get up," I shouted, rushing toward him. Then I saw what he was looking at. Something was emerging from the collapsed section of the tunnel. It wasn't a person. It was too long, too thin. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, bending at angles that weren't right. The flashlight's beam wavered across its surface, but there was no definition, no clear skin, no clothes, no eyes. Just a shifting, writhing darkness, like the space around it refused to let it exist properly. It moved toward us without a sound. No footsteps, no breathing, just the oppressive silence growing heavier, thick like tar. I grabbed my friend's arm, yanking him up. Run. We didn't need to be told twice. We tore through the tunnel, dodging debris, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from that thing. Then ahead, another split. The left path was mostly intact. The right, narrower, lower, but shorter. I could see a faint sliver of light at the end. An exit. We went right. The tunnel got tighter. The ceiling sloped downward, forcing us to crouch as we ran. The air grew thicker, hotter, suffocating. The walls felt like they were closing in. Then, a sound you'll never forget. A shriek. Not human. Not animal. Something between a wail and a gurgle, like it was struggling to make noise, like it didn't know how. The flashlight beams flickered. My vision blurred. I felt something behind me. No, around me. The air vibrated, and a pressure built in my skull, like my ears were about to burst. The exit was close. So close. The light ahead was growing brighter. I reached for it. And then, whack! Like someone had slammed a door in my face. Like the tunnel had been swallowed whole. I couldn't see. I couldn't hear. I couldn't move. I felt my friends next to me, but I couldn't reach them. The tunnel was gone. The air was gone. The world was gone. And in the suffocating void, something spoke. Not out loud. Not in a voice. But inside my head. Words I didn't understand. Words that weren't meant for humans. A whisper that burrowed into my brain, curling around my thoughts, forcing me to listen. Then, light. Blinding. My body lurched forward. I collapsed onto rough gravel, gasping, coughing, retching as the cold night air hit my lungs. I was outside. I was alive. I turned to see my friend sprawled beside me, pale and shaking. The tunnel entrance behind us was gone. Just a wall of solid rock. Like it had never been there. I couldn't breathe. My chest heaved, my throat raw from gasping for air. My hands dug into the gravel beneath me, desperate for something solid, something real. The cold night air bit into my skin, but I barely felt it. I was too focused on the ground, on the sensation of dirt and stone beneath my fingers. I didn't dare look up. Not yet. My friends were beside me, equally wrecked. My third friend was still coughing violently, clutching at his chest like his lungs were failing him. The other had his head between his knees, rocking slightly, whispering something under his breath. I swallowed hard and forced myself to lift my head. We were outside. The sky above was ink black, scattered with distant stars. A half moon hung in the air, casting just enough light to see our surroundings. But the tunnel was gone. Where the entrance had been, where we had just come from, there was nothing but a jagged rock face, as if the tunnel had never existed at all. "No," I breathed, my voice barely more than a whisper. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling forward, my palms slapping against the cold stone. My flashlight was still in my other hand, trembling, the beam skimming uselessly across the solid surface. This wasn't possible. We had been inside. We had run through this tunnel. We had seen it, touched it, lived it, and now it was gone. My friend staggered up beside me, pressing his hands against the rock, pushing, scraping, searching for something, a crack, a doorway, anything to prove that we hadn't just hallucinated the entire thing. "There's nothing here," he choked out. He turned to me, his eyes wide, reflecting the moonlight like a wild animal caught in headlights. "How is there nothing here?" I didn't have an answer. My third friend was still sitting on the ground, his arms wrapped around his knees, rocking slightly. "I heard it," he mumbled. "I heard it." I didn't want to ask what. I already knew. I could still feel the words, the ones that had crawled into my brain, into my bones, seeping into the deepest parts of me where they would never fully leave. I didn't understand them, not in the way you understand a spoken language. But I knew, deep down, that I wasn't supposed to have heard them at all, that none of us were. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. Nobody argued. We left in silence, stumbling our way back through the abandoned lot, past the rusted fences, past the overgrown train tracks that had once led us here. And the entire time, I fought the overwhelming feeling that we weren't alone. That whatever had been in that tunnel, whatever had whispered into our minds, had followed us out. That night, we didn't talk about what had happened. We just sat in my friend's car, parked under the dim glow of a streetlight, staring ahead in silence. None of us wanted to be alone. When the sun finally started creeping over the horizon, we went home. I barely slept. Days passed, then weeks. None of us spoke about the tunnel. Not to each other. Not to anyone. It was like some unspoken agreement. If we ignored it, maybe it would lose its grip on us. Maybe it would fade, like a bad dream. But it didn't. I couldn't stop thinking about it. About the way the tunnel just disappeared. About the thing that had followed us, stretching and twisting in the dark. About the whisper in my head that didn't belong to me. At first, I told myself it was just lingering fear. Trauma messing with my mind. But then the nightmares started. I would wake up gasping for air, my ears ringing with a sound I couldn't describe. A pressure would settle in my skull, heavy and suffocating, just like in the tunnel. And in the darkness of my room, I would feel it, something just beyond my vision, something that shouldn't be there. It never spoke again, but I knew it was watching. My friends weren't doing any better. The one who had fallen in the tunnel barely spoke anymore. The other tried to pretend everything was fine, but I could see it in his face, the exhaustion, the paranoia, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder when he thought no one was looking. We never went back to that area. I don't think we could, even if we wanted to. I tried once, weeks later, driven by something I couldn't explain. I drove near the site, parked a few blocks away, walked through the overgrown lots, and nothing was there. No collapsed tunnel, no old train entrance, no rusted fence. Just empty land and an unbroken rock wall, like the tunnel had never existed. But I know it did. I know something was in there. It all started on an ordinary evening in a place that felt safe. A town that wasn't too small, but not exactly busy either. The kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked during the day and kids ride their bikes past dusk. I lived on the edge of that town, in a quiet neighborhood lined with tall trees that whispered against the wind at night. My apartment sat on the second floor of a building that had seen better days: peeling paint, a flickering hallway light that nobody ever fixed, and a front door that stuck when it got too humid. I had moved in a year earlier, settling into a routine that felt predictable. Work, gym, home. On most nights, it'd make something quick to eat, scroll through my phone, and zone out in front of the TV before eventually heading to bed. The window in my bedroom overlooked the street below, and from where I lay, I could see the tops of trees swaying and the dim glow of streetlights. It wasn't much, but it was home. That night was like any other. I had a late shift at work, got home around 10, tossed my keys on the counter, and heated up some leftovers. I remember staring at the microwave as the numbers counted down, my reflection barely visible in the glass. My phone buzzed, a text from a coworker about something I'd already forgotten by morning. By 11:30, I was in bed, scrolling through random videos, letting the glow of the screen lull me into that foggy state where sleep starts to creep in. Outside, the wind had picked up. The old tree near my window scratched against the siding like it always did, a sound I had learned to tune out. I barely noticed when the scratching stopped. I don't know what made me look up. Maybe it was the absence of that familiar noise or the sudden awareness that something felt off. But when I did, my eyes went straight to the window, and there it was, a shape, a shadow, standing just beyond the glass. I sat up so fast that my phone slipped from my hand and landed on the floor. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The streetlight behind it cast just enough glow to outline a figure, tall, motionless, staring in. But that was impossible. I was on the second floor. For a few seconds, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light. A branch, maybe, or a shadow from something outside. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. Something was standing outside my window, and it wasn't moving. I blinked hard, my pulse hammering. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but I hesitated. I didn't want to take my eyes off it. Every nerve in my body told me that the moment I looked away, something would change. So I sat there, frozen, staring at this unmoving shape just beyond the glass. Then, slowly, the figure shifted. Not much, just enough to let me know that it wasn't a shadow or a trick of my tired mind. It was real. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and my mind scrambled for an explanation that didn't make my skin crawl. There had to be a logical reason for this. A shadow from the streetlight, maybe? Some weird illusion from the reflection in the glass. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, one undeniable fact remained. Something was standing outside my window. The shape didn't move again. It just stood there, watching. No discernible features, no face that I could make out, just a dark outline against the faint glow of the street lamp behind it. I wanted to move, to do something, but my body felt locked in place. My phone was still on the floor, the screen now dark, just inches from my hand. I forced myself to reach for it, fingers shaking as I unlocked it. The screen's brightness nearly blinded me, but I didn't dare take my eyes off the figure. I turned on the camera and raised it toward the window. The screen showed my dimly lit room, my bed, my nightstand, and the curtain pulled halfway across the glass. But where the figure should have been, there was nothing. Just the empty night. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I lowered the phone and looked again with my own eyes. It was still there. I lifted the phone again. Nothing. Lowered it. The figure remained. My throat was dry. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stand, every muscle in my legs tensing. I took a cautious step closer, my bare feet pressing into the cold hardwood floor. The air in the room felt suddenly heavy, thick, like I had stepped into something unseen. I inched forward, reaching for the curtain, fingers trembling as I gripped the fabric. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might shake my ribs loose. With one quick motion, I yanked the curtain all the way open. Nothing. The figure was gone. I stared at the empty glass, my reflection looking back at me, pale and shaken. My breath fogged up the window slightly, a sharp contrast to the cool air in my room. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe it really had been a trick of the light, some weird illusion created by my half-asleep brain. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. But I didn't. Even as I climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chest, my body remained on edge. My ears strained for any sound outside, any clue that would tell me someone or something had actually been there. But all I could hear was the wind, the distant hum of a car passing by, and the creaking of the old apartment building settling into the night. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shape standing outside my window, motionless, waiting. The next morning, the logical side of my brain took over. I told myself it had been nothing, a shadow, a weird reflection, the wind messing with the trees. But the unease in my chest didn't fade. As I got ready for work, I found myself hesitating before looking out the window again. It was stupid, I knew that, but part of me was afraid that the shape would still be there, watching in the daylight. When I finally forced myself to peek, all I saw was the empty street below. The tree that had once stood near my window had been cut down months ago. Nothing should have been able to cast a shadow that high. I shook it off and left for work, pushing the night's events to the back of my mind. By the time I got home that evening, I had almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Almost. But as I stepped inside, flipping on the light, something felt wrong. The air smelled slightly different, like dust had been stirred up, a barely noticeable change, but enough to put me on edge. I glanced around the apartment. Everything was exactly how I had left it. The door had been locked when I came in. My keys were still in my hand, the weight of them familiar. And yet, the uneasy feeling didn't fade. I moved through the apartment, checking each room without really knowing what I was looking for. It wasn't until I reached my bedroom that my stomach twisted into a knot. The curtain was open. I knew I had closed it that morning. I had been too shaken to leave it open. And yet, there it was, fully drawn back, exposing the glass, the outside world beyond it. My first instinct was to grab my phone again, but I hesitated. The way the curtain hung, so deliberately parted, it felt wrong, like something was waiting for me to react. For the first time since moving in, I felt unsafe in my own home. I took slow steps toward the window, my breath shallow, eyes scanning for any sign of movement outside. The street looked normal. The trees stood still in the night air, no strange shadows stretching across the pavement. But my gut told me otherwise. Someone had been here. I checked the locks, both on the front door and the windows. Everything was secure. But that didn't make me feel better. If someone had been in my apartment, why wasn't anything else disturbed? No drawers open, no furniture shifted, nothing missing. Just the curtain. A single, silent message. I barely slept again that night. Every time I started to drift off, I would snap awake, convinced I had heard something. A noise just beyond my hearing, too faint to pinpoint. By morning, exhaustion settled deep in my bones. I debated calling someone, maybe the landlord, the police, but what would I even say? That I saw a shadow outside my window and my curtain moved? They'd write it off as paranoia, maybe even laugh about it when I wasn't around. So I told myself, again, that it was nothing, that I had left the curtain open without remembering, that I was making too much of this. For the rest of the day, I tried not to think about it. I went to work. I ran some errands. I stayed out later than usual, not really wanting to go back home. But eventually, I had no choice. That night, I double-checked every lock, every window. I made sure the curtain was closed, even wedging a small chair against it so it wouldn't move. And then I forced myself to sleep. Hours passed in restless, broken dreams, the kind that leave you feeling more drained than refreshed. But at some point, exhaustion won out. Then, just past 3 a.m, a sound, soft, slow, coming from the window. A light tapping. I sat up so fast that the blood rushed from my head, making me dizzy. My eyes locked onto the window. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I reached out, fingers trembling, and pulled the curtain just an inch to the side. Just enough to see. My heart stopped. The figure was back. And this time, it was closer, pressed against the glass. It was right there, not standing in the distance, not a vague shape beyond the streetlight. This time, it was pressed against the glass. The window pane barely separated us, a thin sheet of glass between me and it. I couldn't see its face. It was shrouded in darkness, an outline of something humanoid, but wrong. The way it stood, its posture slightly hunched, hands resting lightly against the glass, fingers too long, too slender. The dim streetlight outside barely caught its form, but enough to confirm what I feared. It was real. My chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. My brain screamed at me to do something, but I couldn't even swallow. My throat was dry, my muscles frozen in place. Then it moved. Not a sudden jolt, not an aggressive action, just a slow tilt of its head, as if studying me, as if it knew I was watching. I clenched my jaw, forcing my body to break free from its paralysis. I scrambled for my phone on the nightstand, knocking over a glass of water in the process. My fingers fumbled over the screen as I swiped at it, trying to activate the camera. When I looked up, it was gone. The window was empty again, just my own reflection staring back at me, wide-eyed and pale. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, phone still clutched in my hand, chest rising and falling rapidly. I tried to convince myself it had just been my imagination, that my sleep-deprived mind had conjured something that wasn't there. But then I noticed something. A faint outline on the glass. Smudges, like handprints. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisted. That meant it wasn't just in my head. It had really been there. The room felt impossibly still, the air heavy like a storm was about to break. The silence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to get out. But where would I even go? Instead, I forced myself to get up, legs trembling as I stumbled toward the window. I reached out and touched one of the smudges, half expecting it to vanish on contact. But it was real. My fingers came away slightly damp, as if something had pressed against the glass with unnatural heat. I stepped back, my stomach churning. I locked the window, even though I knew it had already been locked, and pulled the curtain shut. Then I grabbed my desk chair and wedged it against the curtain, blocking it completely. It didn't feel like enough. I spent the rest of the night sitting in bed, back against the headboard, blanket pulled around me like it could shield me from whatever was outside. Every tiny sound made me jump. The ticking of the clock, the occasional creak of the apartment settling. Even my own breathing felt too loud. I didn't sleep. By the time morning light filtered in, my body was stiff with exhaustion. I waited until the sun was fully up before I dared move. With shaky hands, I pulled the curtain aside, dreading what I might see. The street was quiet. No strange figures, no lingering shadows. Just an empty sidewalk and a few cars parked along the curb. But the smudges were still there. That was it. I couldn't ignore this anymore. I grabbed a rag and wiped the glass clean, as if erasing the evidence would somehow make me feel safer. Then I pulled on some clothes, grabbed my keys, and left my apartment. I needed answers. I started with the landlord. His office was downstairs, tucked into a small space next to the building's entrance. I knocked, shifting my weight impatiently until he finally opened the door. He was an older man, thinning gray hair, glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up from his paperwork with a tired expression. "Something wrong?" he asked. I hesitated, not sure how to phrase what I had seen without sounding like a lunatic. Has anyone ever complained about people hanging around outside the building at night? His brows furrowed. Like trespassers? Yeah, or just anyone acting weird. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. This is a quiet building. We don't get much trouble. No reports of break-ins or anything like that. I chewed the inside of my cheek. What about before I moved in? Did anyone else ever mention something strange? His eyes narrowed slightly. You're talking about your apartment specifically? My gut twisted. Yeah. He didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. For a moment, I thought he was going to brush me off. But then he sighed. The last guy who lived there left in a hurry, he admitted. I tensed. Why? Said he wasn't comfortable there anymore. Wouldn't say why, just that he wanted to break his lease early. I let him go. Figured he had his reasons. My stomach sank. Did he say anything else? He shook his head. Not to me. I pressed my lips together, debating whether or not to tell him what I had seen. But what would be the point? He already thought it was nothing. And maybe, just maybe, it was nothing. But my gut told me otherwise. I left the office with more questions than answers. That night, I wasn't taking any chances. I triple-checked the locks. I made sure the curtains were completely shut. I even dragged my dresser a few inches in front of the window. Not enough to block it completely, but enough to make me feel like I had some barrier between me and whatever was out there. And still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I sat in bed with the lamp on, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself. But my eyes kept drifting toward the window, toward the space where the figure had been. Then, a noise! Soft, scraping, right outside the window. My blood ran cold. I sat completely still, heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Another scrape. Then a tap. Soft, deliberate. I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling, and switched to the camera. Slowly, I turned it toward the window, my stomach twisting into knots. The moment the screen adjusted to the dim light, a face pressed against the glass. Pale, almost featureless. A mouth that wasn't quite right, slightly open, revealing teeth that didn't look human. Eyes that were too wide, staring directly at me. I dropped the phone. I scrambled backward, knocking over my nightstand in my panic. The lamp crashed to the floor, plunging the room into darkness. My breath came in sharp gasps, my body locked in place. The tapping continued. Slow, rhythmic, like it knew I was watching. I forced myself to grab my phone again, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the window. Nothing. No face. No figure. Just the empty glass. But the handprint was still there. And this time, it was on the inside. The handprint on the inside of the glass was fresh, the condensation from my breath making it even more distinct. It wasn't my hand. It was bigger, the fingers unnaturally long, stretched in a way that didn't make sense. My chest tightened as I forced myself to stay still, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Then, tap, tap, tap. I flinched. My body instinctively jerked backward, nearly tripping over the fallen lamp. The tapping didn't come from the window anymore. It came from inside the room. My stomach twisted into knots. The air was thick, pressing down on me like an unseen weight. My hands trembled as I pointed the flashlight toward the sound. The beam flickered over the walls, the furniture, the scattered objects from my knocked-over nightstand. But nothing else. The room was empty. I turned in slow, uneven breaths, scanning every inch of the space. The closet door stood slightly ajar, but I knew for a fact it had been closed when I went to bed. Something was here. I gritted my teeth, forcing my shaky legs to move. I stepped toward the closet, my pulse pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Every instinct told me to run, to leave, but I couldn't just ignore it. I reached out, fingers barely brushing against the edge of the door. And then, it slammed shut. I jumped back, the breath rushing out of my lungs in a sharp gasp. My heart was going to explode. I could feel it hammering against my ribs. Then, slowly, something moved behind the door. I heard it before I saw it, a soft, shuffling sound, like bare feet dragging across the floor. My throat tightened as I raised my phone again, hand shaking so badly the flashlight beam wavered. And then, the door creaked open. Not fast. Not like before. This time, it was slow, methodical. The hinges groaned, the space beyond it too dark, swallowing the light before it could reach inside. And then, I saw it. A hand emerging from the darkness. Not quite human. The fingers were wrong, long, thin, bent at unnatural angles. The skin was smooth, too smooth, like wax. And then the second hand appeared, gripping the edge of the door frame as if pulling itself out. I couldn't move. My body refused to function. My vision blurred at the edges, the sheer terror turning my limbs to stone. And then it stepped forward. The thing that had been watching me. The thing that had left the handprints. The thing that should not have been inside my room. It was tall. Its body was thin, almost emaciated, but wrongly proportioned. Its arms too long, its legs slightly bent as if they had never been used correctly. Its face. God, its face. There were no real features. No nose. No eyebrows. Just those eyes, hollow and dark, and a mouth that seemed permanently slightly open, revealing rows of thin, jagged teeth. I felt my stomach lurch. It was smiling. Not a normal smile. Not an expression of joy. It was a grotesque, stretched thing, unnatural and forced, like the muscles beneath the skin had been trained to imitate human emotion, but didn't quite get it right. It tilted its head, the same way it had outside my window, like it was studying me, like it knew. Then it moved. Not a slow, creeping approach, not a gradual advance. It lunged. I screamed. My body finally obeyed, and I threw myself backward, crashing into my bed. My phone flew from my hand, the flashlight spinning wildly across the room before landing face down on the carpet, plunging everything into darkness. The sound of my ragged breathing filled the air. I scrambled, trying to find my phone, to find any source of light, but my fingers found only fabric and hardwood. Then, a sound. A rasping breath. Right above me. I felt it before I saw it. The air shifted, something looming over me, something too close. I squeezed my eyes shut, my entire body trembling. Then, a whisper. Low. Wrong. My own voice, but distorted. You left the window open. I gasped, my eyes flying open, but there was nothing. The air was still. The room was empty. The only sound was my own shuddering breaths. The closet door stood wide open, but whatever had been inside was gone. And then I saw it. The window. The one I had locked. The one I had blocked with my dresser. It was wide open. The curtains fluttered gently in the breeze. The night was silent outside, still and undisturbed. No footsteps. No signs of forced entry. But I knew it had been in here. And worse, it had left the way it came. Like it could come back, whenever it wanted. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every shadow in my room felt wrong. Every movement in the dark, a possible sign that it was still there. I sat frozen on my bed, my back pressed against the headboard, gripping my phone like a lifeline. The screen was still on, the battery draining as the flashlight app remained open. The weak glow barely pushed back the darkness, but I didn't dare turn it off. The window was still open. The curtains moved with the breeze, slow and unnatural, like something was still just outside, waiting. I wanted to get up, to close it, but my body refused to move. The memory of those fingers, that smile, the sound of my own voice whispering from the dark, it paralyzed me. For hours, I just sat there, watching, listening. Nothing happened. No tapping, no handprints, no shifting shadows. But that didn't mean it was gone. When the first light of morning crept through the open window, my body finally allowed me to move. The fear hadn't disappeared, but daylight made the nightmare feel slightly less suffocating. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally, even though every instinct told me that rationality had no place in what had happened. I had to check. With slow, careful steps, I moved toward the window. The floor was ice cold beneath my bare feet, every sound amplified in the morning stillness. The outside world looked normal, the same trees, the same street, the same houses. There was no sign that anything had stood there, watching me. I reached out, hesitating only for a moment before gripping the window pane and slamming it shut. The lock clicked into place, but as soon as I did it, a sick feeling churned in my stomach. It had been locked before, and it had opened anyway. I didn't feel safer. I stepped back, rubbing my arms against the cold. My phone vibrated in my hand. A text. I looked down. It was from my friend. "Hey man, you good? You were acting weird last night." My skin prickled. Last night? I didn't reply right away. Instead, I went to my messages and scrolled up, looking for anything I might have sent. My stomach dropped. There was a message from me at 3:12 a.m. "I'm fine, just tired." I didn't send that. I know I didn't. I left my apartment later that morning, needing to get out, to be around people, to convince myself that what happened wasn't real. I grabbed coffee, walked through crowded streets, surrounded myself with normalcy. But it didn't help. I felt it everywhere. In the reflections of windows, in the space between people, in the way my shadows seemed off, slightly delayed, slightly warped. When I got home, I didn't go straight to my bedroom. I hesitated at the door, staring at the window. It was still locked. The curtains were still, but the air felt thick, like something unseen had taken up space. I forced myself to go inside, locking the front door behind me. I checked everything, the locks, the doors, the closets. Nothing had moved. Nothing had changed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that it was still here, waiting. That night, I made sure the window was locked, double-checked it, pushed my dresser in front of it, just in case. But sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the apartment, every shift in the shadows sent a jolt through my body. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I must have dozed off. And then, I woke up. The air in my room was wrong. Heavy. Still. Like something was standing over me. I didn't move at first. I just listened. Silence! Then, A whisper, right by my ear. You left the window open. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head slowly, too scared to look, too scared not to, and my eyes landed on the window. Still closed, still locked, but the curtains were swaying, like something had just moved away from them. I didn't stay another night in that apartment. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't care where I went. I just knew I couldn't stay. I crashed at a friend's place, ignoring their questions, brushing off their concerns. I never told them what happened, because I knew they wouldn't believe me. I barely believed it myself. But every now and then, I still wake up in the middle of the night, feeling that thick, heavy air pressing against my skin. I never went back to that apartment. I told the landlord some excuse, something about an emergency, something about needing to leave town. I didn't even bother getting my deposit back. It didn't matter. Nothing about that place mattered anymore. But leaving didn't mean forgetting. I tried to push it away, to bury it under logic, under exhaustion, under the constant noise of life. But every night, when the world went quiet, it came back. The feeling, the unease, that suffocating awareness of something unseen just out of reach. At first, it was small things. A shadow in the corner of my eye. A moment of hesitation before turning off the lights. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was just shaken up. That's what trauma does, right? It lingers. It makes you see things that aren't really there. But then, I started hearing it. Not often. Just sometimes. When I was alone. When the night was too quiet. A whisper. So faint, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. Almost. You left the window open. Always the same words. Always in my own voice. No matter where I went. I moved to a new city, took a new job, surrounded myself with people. I kept the lights on at night, kept my windows shut, avoided looking too long at reflections. And for a while, it seemed to work. The whispers faded. The unease became just a memory. I started to feel normal again. Until last night. I was in bed, scrolling through my phone, barely keeping my eyes open. The window was closed, the curtains drawn tight. Everything was still. Then my phone vibrated. A message. I blinked, the exhaustion making my vision blur for a second before I focused on the screen. A message from me. Sent at 3:12 a.m. I'm fine. Just tired. My stomach twisted. I hadn't sent that. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I wasn't alone in the room anymore. I felt it before I saw it. That thick, suffocating presence pressing down on me, the air turning heavy. My breath hitched, my pulse hammering in my ears as my eyes moved, slowly, too afraid to see, but unable to stop myself. And then I saw it. Not in the shadows. Not in the corner. In the reflection. The mirror across the room. I was still in bed. But I wasn't alone. Something was standing behind me. Something with my face. Smiling. I turned so fast I nearly fell off the bed. My heart pounded as I whipped around, searching the room, but nothing was there. Just the dark. Just the silence. But the reflection? The reflection was still smiling. And then it blinked. I don't know what it wants. I don't know if it's real, if it ever was, if it's always been there, waiting. But I do know one thing. No matter where I go, no matter what I do, I'll never be alone again. It all started a few years ago, back when I was living in an old apartment building in Chicago. The kind of place that had history written all over it. Tall, narrow hallways, creaky wooden floors, and an elevator that looked like it belonged in a black and white movie. It was one of those classic cage-style elevators with a metal gate you had to slide shut before it would move. The whole thing rattled and groaned like it hated being used, but most of us in the building relied on it. The stairwells smelled like mildew, and nobody wanted to take the extra effort when they didn't have to. I had moved there after a rough breakup, looking for something affordable but not completely run down. The building had character, sure, but something about it felt off from the moment I arrived. The landlord, an older guy with tired eyes, handed me the keys with a half-hearted warning. "The elevator's old. Don't ride it alone too late." He said it like it was a joke, but there was something in his tone that made me pause. I was on the 6th floor, and the first few weeks were uneventful. My daily routine was simple. I worked long hours at a printing press downtown, came home late, grabbed takeout from the Chinese place around the corner, and crashed in front of the TV. The apartment itself was nothing special. A tiny one-bedroom with outdated fixtures, dim lighting, and windows that rattled whenever the wind picked up. The building was never completely quiet. Pipes knocked in the walls, and every now and then, I'd hear footsteps above me, even though the unit upstairs was supposedly empty. I got used to the sounds. The creaks, the distant hum of conversations through the thin walls, the occasional scratching noise in the vents that I told myself was just mice. The elevator, though, that was something else. It had a habit of stopping on random floors when no one had pressed the button. It'd be riding up to my floor, watching the old dial slowly tick higher, and suddenly it would jerk to a halt on the 3rd or 4th floor. The gate would slide open with a loud clang, revealing an empty hallway. No one there. No footsteps walking away. Just stillness. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My neighbor, an older woman who had lived there for over a decade, mentioned it casually one day. "That thing's got a mind of its own," she said as we waited together in the lobby. "I don't take it after dark." When I asked why, she just shrugged. "It doesn't like being used too much." I laughed it off, assuming she was just superstitious. But then I started paying attention. The way the buttons would sometimes light up on their own. The way the air inside the elevator always felt slightly colder than the rest of the building. The way I always had this strange feeling of being watched whenever I was in there alone. Still, it was just an old elevator. Things like that happened in old buildings all the time. At least, that's what I told myself. Until one night, when I came home late and everything changed. It was a Wednesday night, one of those brutally long days at work that left me feeling half dead by the time I got home. I had stayed late to finish a batch of prints, and by the time I finally dragged myself out of the office, it was close to midnight. The streets were mostly empty, the usual hum of traffic replaced by the occasional honk or distant siren. By the time I reached my apartment building, my feet felt like lead. I didn't even think twice about heading straight for the elevator. The thought of climbing 6 flights of stairs in my state wasn't appealing. I pressed the button and waited, listening as the ancient machine groaned its way down from whatever floor it had been abandoned on. The moment the gate rattled open, I knew something was off. For one, the air inside felt different. Stale. Like no one had been inside for days. The temperature dropped the second I stepped in, and as the gate slid shut behind me, I felt a prickle run down my spine. I pressed the button for my floor, and the elevator started moving with its usual jerky rhythm. But before it could reach the 2nd floor, it shuddered and came to a stop. Not a slow, mechanical halt. Not the kind of pause I'd gotten used to when it stopped on random floors. This was abrupt, sudden, almost violent. The old light flickered overhead, casting shadows that twisted in the grates. I pressed the button again, then again, jabbing at it harder this time. Nothing. The dial above the door was stuck between floors, the hand trembling slightly, as if unsure where to go next. I sighed, rubbing my temple. It wasn't the first time the thing had glitched out. Usually, if I waited a few seconds, it would start moving again. But then, the gate started to open. Not fully. Just an inch or two. My stomach tightened. The thing about these old elevators is that the gate shouldn't move unless the car is properly aligned with the floor. Yet, here it was, slowly inching open, revealing nothing but a sliver of pitch-black space beyond. I stepped back, pressing myself against the wall. My heart pounded in my ears. The gap in the gate was small, just enough to see darkness beyond it. No lights from a hallway. No sign of a floor at all. Just a void. Then, something moved. It was quick. Too quick to fully register. A flicker of motion in the darkness, like a shadow shifting where no shadow should be. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to look away, to shut my eyes, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But I couldn't. My body refused to move. A whisper of cold air brushed against my skin. Not a breeze, not a draft. Something else. Something unnatural. The gate slid shut with a metallic clang, and the elevator jolted violently, sending me stumbling forward. The overhead light flickered again, casting warped shadows across the metal walls. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the elevator resumed its ascent. By the time it reached my floor, I was gripping the railing so hard my knuckles were white. The moment the gate opened, I bolted out, practically throwing myself into the hallway. I stood there for a second, trying to steady my breath before glancing back. The elevator sat there, its gate wide open, waiting, as if expecting me to get back in. I turned and hurried to my apartment, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Lying in bed, I kept replaying it over and over in my head. The flicker of movement in the darkness, the cold air, the feeling of something watching. By morning, I had convinced myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had been exhausted after all. Maybe I had imagined the movement. Maybe the elevator had simply malfunctioned, and I had let my exhaustion turn it into something more. That's what I told myself. Until it happened again. The next few days, I avoided the elevator as much as I could. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was overreacting, but every time I passed the metal gate in the lobby, my stomach twisted. Something was wrong with that thing. I started taking the stairs. It was a hassle, but at least the stairwell felt real. Solid. I could hear my own footsteps echoing off the walls, feel the strain in my legs as I climbed. The elevator, though. The thought of stepping inside again made my skin crawl. I tried not to talk about it. I didn't want to sound crazy. But one night, as I was unlocking my apartment door, my neighbor, the same older woman who had warned me about the elevator before, cleared her throat behind me. "You felt it, didn't you?" she asked. I turned slowly. Felt what? She gave me a knowing look, her wrinkled hands gripping the handles of her grocery bags. "The elevator," she said. "You've stopped using it." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. She just nodded, like she had seen this happen before. "You live here long enough, you learn to listen to it." Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "It don't like to be used too much." That phrase again. I forced a laugh. "It's just old," I said. "Jumps a little. Probably needs maintenance." She didn't laugh. "That's what the last guy said." My smile faltered. "Last guy?" She looked me over for a second, then shook her head. "Never mind. Just don't be in there alone after dark." With that, she walked into her apartment and shut the door. I stood there for a long moment, my key still in the lock. I wanted to ask more, but something told me I wouldn't like the answers. By the third night, avoiding the elevator wasn't enough. I had started hearing things. It began subtly, just little noises, faint and distant, like someone shifting their weight inside the walls. I figured it was just the old pipes groaning, the usual sounds of a worn-down building settling into itself. But then it got worse. I started hearing scratching. At first, I thought it was coming from the vents, maybe rats or something. But as I listened, I realized it wasn't the frantic scurrying of rodents. It was slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across metal. And it was coming from the elevator shaft. One night, as I was walking past the elevator on my way up the stairs, I heard it clearer than ever. A long, slow scrape of something sharp against steel. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the closed gate. The scratching continued. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. I wasn't sure what made me do it, but I stepped closer. The air felt colder near the elevator, like a draft seeping through the cracks. My fingers tingled as I reached for the gate, my pulse hammering in my ears. Just as I was about to touch it, the scratching stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, with a loud clang, the gate rattled, as if something had slammed against it from the inside. I jumped back so fast I nearly tripped. My breath hitched in my throat, my hands trembling. The elevator didn't move. The numbers above the door didn't light up. It just sat there, silent and waiting. I bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding the whole way. The next morning, I called the landlord. I kept my voice even, trying to sound casual. "Hey, the elevator's been acting weird lately. Making noises, stopping on random floors. Might be time for a checkup." There was a long pause on the other end. Then he sighed. "It's fine." "Fine?" I echoed. "It scared the hell out of me last night." "Then don't use it." His tone was flat, dismissive. "What's wrong with it?" I asked. Another pause. Then, quietly, "It's old." Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. "That's not an answer," I pressed. He sighed again. "Look, if you're having problems with it, just take the stairs. Plenty of folks in that building do." That was the end of the conversation. He hung up before I could say anything else. I stared at my phone, uneasy. He knew something. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what my neighbor had said. The last guy. I had lived in the building for a few months, but I never really got to know anyone. People kept to themselves, and I liked it that way. But now, I needed answers. I knocked on her door. She answered after a few moments, peering at me through the chain lock. "The man who lived in my unit before me," I said. "What happened to him?" She hesitated. Then, she sighed and unlatched the door. I stepped inside. Her apartment was small but cozy, filled with old books and the faint scent of lavender. She gestured for me to sit. "He was young," she said, lowering herself into the chair across from me. "Didn't talk much. Kept to himself." "What happened?" She hesitated again. Then her voice dropped to a whisper. "He disappeared." I frowned. "Disappeared?" She nodded. "One night, he got into the elevator, never came back out." A shiver ran down my spine. They found his apartment door open. His wallet, keys, everything still inside. But he was gone. I swallowed hard. "No cameras in this building," she continued. "No proof of anything. Cops didn't do much. Just called it a missing person case and left it at that." I tried to process what she was saying. "And you think the elevator had something to do with it?" Her eyes darkened. "I think he didn't listen." A lump formed in my throat. "Listen to what?" I asked. She glanced toward her own door, as if afraid someone might be listening. Then she leaned in. "It doesn't like to be used too much." My breath hitched. I stood up, my hands shaking. I should go." She didn't try to stop me. As I stepped back into the hallway, I felt it again, that chill in the air, the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. The elevator sat at the end of the hall, its gate slightly ajar, waiting. That night, I dreamed of the elevator. I was standing inside, the dim light flickering overhead. The buttons were all lit up, glowing like tiny eyes in the darkness. The elevator started moving, but the numbers didn't change. Then, the gate began to slide open, revealing nothing. Just blackness. An endless, yawning void. Something moved in the darkness. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. Cold air rushed past me, and then, a hand shot out of the void. Pale, skeletal fingers grasping for me. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. My room was ice cold. And then, from the hallway outside, I heard the elevator ding. I lay frozen in my bed, staring at the ceiling. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it. The ding echoed again from the hallway. The elevator had stopped on my floor. I forced myself up, my body stiff with fear. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay in bed, to ignore it, but I couldn't. I had to see. Slowly, I moved toward my apartment door, pressing my ear against it. Silence! Then, metal creaking, the sound of the elevator gate being pushed open. I sucked in a breath, my hands shaking as I gripped the doorknob. Every rational thought told me to stay put, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But something deeper, something instinctual, urged me forward. I turned the lock. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by the flickering overhead bulbs. The elevator door was open. My stomach twisted into knots. No one was inside. And yet, the air in front of the open gate felt wrong, like something unseen was standing there, waiting. I stepped closer. The interior of the elevator looked the same as before, scuffed metal walls, dim yellow light, but something felt different. The buttons inside were all dark, lifeless. The elevator shouldn't have moved. A chill ran down my spine. Then, before I could react, the light inside flickered out. And I saw it. A shape! A figure standing in the darkness. I stumbled back, slamming against the wall. My chest tightened, a scream caught in my throat. The shape was just barely visible, a tall, thin shadow, standing motionless just beyond the threshold. It wasn't human. Its head tilted slightly, as if studying me. I felt something press against me, not physically, but in my mind, like an unbearable pressure trying to shove its way into my thoughts. The elevator groaned. The gate slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire hallway. Then, the elevator started moving. Down. I stood there, frozen, my breath coming in short, panic bursts. The numbers above the door weren't changing, just like in my dream. I staggered backward, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. The hallway was silent again, but that wrongness still lingered in the air. I turned and bolted for my apartment, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the deadbolt. I pressed my back against the door, trying to steady my breathing. That thing, whatever it was, had been inside the elevator, watching me, and I had seen it. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I wasn't sure. I sat on the floor, my arms wrapped around my knees, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My neighbor's words kept repeating in my head. It doesn't like to be used too much. Was that what happened to the last guy? Had he seen it too? Had it taken him? I shook the thought away. No, that didn't make sense. Elevators didn't just take people. But then, where had he gone? I hesitated, then pulled out my phone. I needed answers. I searched the guy's name, the one who had lived here before me. Nothing. No missing person reports, no old news articles. It was like he had never existed. I tried searching for other incidents in the building. Still nothing. But something felt off. Like the absence of information was intentional. A sick feeling settled in my gut. I had to get out of here. I grabbed my keys and stood up. My whole body felt tense, like I was being watched. My apartment suddenly felt too small, too still. I needed to leave. Now. But then, ding! The sound made my blood run cold. The elevator had stopped on my floor again. I turned slowly. The light in my hallway flickered. The gate slid open. The elevator was empty. The sickening rawness in the air made my stomach churn. The pressure in my head was back, stronger now, pushing against my skull like an invisible weight. Then, something moved inside the elevator. Not a shape this time. Something in the walls. I could hear it, a faint, wet sound. Like something was shifting just beneath the metal surface. Something alive. And then I heard the whisper. It wasn't a voice. Not exactly. It was a feeling. A presence inside my mind. Come down. My knees nearly buckled. I staggered backward, gripping the doorframe of my apartment for support. My vision blurred for a second, my head pounding. The elevator didn't move. It just sat there, open, as if waiting for me to step inside. I wanted to run. But something inside me, the same twisted curiosity that had made me answer my neighbor's questions, the same pull that had made me look into the open elevator, kept me rooted in place. I had to know. I had to see what was down there. My breath shook as I stepped forward, one foot in front of the other. The air inside the elevator was freezing. The second I crossed the threshold, it felt like I had stepped into another world. The gate slid shut behind me. The buttons were all dark. I reached out, hesitating for only a second before pressing the button for the lobby. Nothing happened. Then, without warning, the elevator plummeted. I slammed into the wall, the force of the descent knocking the air from my lungs. My stomach lurched as the tiny metal box fell, faster than it should have been able to. Faster than gravity. The lights flickered wildly, shadows twisting across the walls. The air felt thick, like I was being crushed from all sides. Then, it stopped. Silence. I was not in the lobby. The doors didn't open. I reached out, pressing every button. Nothing responded. The elevator was dead. Then, a quiet sound. A shuffling. Not inside the elevator. Below it. My breathing turned ragged. The sound got closer, moving up the shaft. Climbing. I pressed myself against the far wall, my pulse hammering so hard it hurt. The light flickered, and then a hand reached through the gate. Pale, thin, fingers too long, curling against the bars. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then another hand, and another. They poured through the gaps in the metal like smoke, twisting, reaching. And just before the light flickered out completely, I saw a face, or something wearing one. It was smiling. And then, darkness. For a few agonizing seconds, I wasn't sure if I had gone blind. The air in the elevator was thick, suffocating. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, the only sound in the oppressive silence. Then, a flicker. A weak, sickly light buzzed back to life above me, barely illuminating the cramped space. My breath hitched. The hands were gone. The thing that had been wearing that grotesque, smiling face. It was no longer visible, but I felt it. I pressed myself into the farthest corner of the elevator, my skin crawling. My trembling fingers hovered over the control panel. Every button remained unlit, dead. My phone, still clutched in my shaking hand, showed no service. I needed to get out. I reached for the emergency button and slammed my fist against it. Nothing. No sound. No response. My breath quickened. The walls of the elevator suddenly felt too close, like they were pressing in, squeezing me. Then, a sound. Faint. Wet. Dripping. It was coming from above me. My eyes snapped upward. The ceiling panel. Something shifted behind it. A slow, deliberate movement. The air grew heavy, pressing down on my chest. My legs felt weak, my entire body screaming at me to move, but I couldn't. And then, the whisper returned. It wasn't a voice. Not really. It was something else, something inside me, a presence crawling through my skull, pressing against my thoughts. You came down. A sharp, searing pain shot through my head. My knees buckled, and I collapsed against the elevator wall. It felt like my mind was being peeled open, like something was crawling inside. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself to move, to do something. My hands found the emergency hatch in the ceiling, and I pushed against it with everything I had. The metal groaned under my weight. Above me, the whispering intensified. I shoved harder. The hatch gave way. A rush of stale, freezing air poured in. Without thinking, I pulled myself up, hoisting my body through the opening. I barely had time to turn around before I saw it. A shape! Half hidden in the shadows, pressed against the elevator shaft wall. Its limbs were wrong, elongated. Its head tilted in that slow, deliberate way I had seen before. It had no eyes, but I knew it was watching me. I scrambled backward, my fingers scraping against the rough metal of the shaft. My foot slipped, nearly sending me tumbling back through the hatch. I didn't look down. I couldn't. The thing moved. Not walked, shifted. A horrible, jerking motion, as if it was glitching through reality itself. I reached for the ladder bolted to the side of the shaft. My fingers wrapped around the cold metal, and I started climbing. Fast. Below me, the elevator shook. A horrible screech echoed through the shaft as the metal groaned. Something heavy slammed into the roof of the elevator. It was coming after me. I climbed faster. My muscles burned, my breath ragged, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The whispering in my head grew louder. Come back! A cold hand brushed my ankle. I kicked violently, nearly losing my grip. My body was moving on pure instinct now, every nerve screaming at me to get out. I could see the faint glow of another hatch above me, my only escape. I reached for it, fingers scraping desperately against the metal. Something grabbed my leg. I screamed. With one final push, I swung up, kicking at whatever had latched onto me. My foot connected with something soft, and the grip loosened just enough for me to pull myself through the upper hatch. I collapsed onto the cold, hard floor. Silence! For a long moment, I just lay there, gasping for breath. My entire body ached, but I was alive. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I might see. The elevator doors in front of me were open. The car was gone. Just an empty shaft, stretching downward into pure, unbroken darkness. Whatever had been inside, it was gone. Or maybe, it was never really there to begin with. I don't remember much after that. Someone must have found me, maybe security, maybe another resident. They said they found me unconscious in the hallway outside the elevator. They thought I had fainted. I didn't correct them. I packed my things that night. I didn't care about breaking my lease. I didn't care about getting my deposit back. I just left. I never used that elevator again. I never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it. A distant ding, even when I'm nowhere near an elevator. And for a split second, I feel something watching me. Waiting. Because I know now, some elevators don't just take you to another floor. Some take you somewhere else, and if you go down too far, you might never come back. I never told anyone the full story. What would I even say? That an elevator in my apartment building had taken me somewhere else? That something not human had been waiting for me there? That I had barely made it out? No one would believe me. And honestly, I don't want them to. Because if they believe me, that means it was real. That means it could happen again. I left that apartment building without looking back. I didn't even return for the things I left behind. Old clothes, dishes, furniture. None of it mattered. Nothing was worth the risk of stepping into that place again. I moved to a different part of the city, into a smaller apartment on the 3rd floor of a walk-up building. No elevators, just stairs. That was the only requirement I had when searching for a new place. I didn't care about rent, location, or amenities, as long as I never had to step into another elevator. For a while, I thought I was okay. I tried to tell myself that maybe I imagined it, that stress, lack of sleep, or something else had messed with my head. But deep down, I knew that was a lie, because the signs never stopped. Late at night, when the city was quiet, I would hear it. A faint ding. Not from my building, there were no elevators here, but somewhere nearby. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just a nearby office building or another apartment complex. But the sound always seemed too close. And then, the whispers started again. Not all the time. Not as loud as before. But in the dead of night, when my mind was drifting between sleep and wakefulness, I would hear it. A soft voice pressing into my thoughts. Come back. Some nights, I would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. And every time, I would have this awful feeling that if I looked towards my bedroom door, I wouldn't be alone. I stopped sleeping well. I started avoiding tall buildings altogether. If a place required an elevator, I didn't go. It didn't matter if it was a job interview, a friend's apartment, or a doctor's office. I took the stairs. Always. Because I knew if I ever stepped into another elevator, it wouldn't take me where I wanted to go. It would take me back. A few weeks ago, something happened that made me realize this isn't over. I was walking home late from work. The streets were mostly empty, the air crisp with the chill of an approaching storm. My new apartment was only a few blocks away, and I was eager to get inside. Then I passed a hotel. Nothing fancy. Just an old, worn-down building with a flickering neon vacancy sign. The kind of place you'd hardly give a second glance. But as I walked by, I heard it. Ding! My body went rigid. Slowly, I turned my head. The hotel's front doors were glass, and beyond them, I could see the lobby. Dimly lit. Empty. Except for the elevator. The doors were open. The inside was dark, too dark, like looking into a void. And then, the worst part. The button panel inside the elevator wasn't normal. There were only 2 buttons. Up and down. I stared, my stomach twisting into knots. I wasn't even inside the building. I wasn't even close to the elevator. But I felt it. The same presence. The same cold grip on my thoughts. And then, a figure moved inside the elevator. Not a person. Something else. Something with 2 long limbs, tilting its head in that slow, unnatural way. It saw me. I don't remember running. I don't remember how I got home. But I locked my door that night and didn't sleep. Because I knew I had left it behind. But it hadn't left me. And sooner or later, it was going to find me again. So if you ever step into an elevator and you notice something off, maybe the buttons don't look right. Maybe the doors close too slowly. Maybe, just maybe, you feel something watching you. Get out. Because some elevators don't take you where you want to go. They take you somewhere you should never have been. And once you go down too far, you may never come back.